CrissCross by Lynn Ray Perkins. Read for the Wellfleet Public Library, published by Green Willow Book, Harper Trophy, with thanks to the imprint of HarperCollins Publishers. Chapter 3. Boys, Dogs, Science Fiction. Debbie and Christiane and their neighbor Tessie lay prostrate on their chaise lounges. It was the first really good laying out day of the season. They had a radio and wet glasses with drinks full of melting ice. Every half hour or so they turned 90 degrees, like chickens roasting on invisible rotisseries. They also adjusted their orientation to the sun as it moved across the sky to allow its ultraviolet rays to be inflicted most directly and effectively. After the third turn, Debbie raised the back of her lounge chair so she could sit up, and opened a book she'd brought out with her. She was immediately absorbed in reading, and sat motionless while Tessie and Christiane continued their quarter-turn rotations for a few more spins, then folded up their chairs to go inside. One of them must have said something to her. The remnant of a question hung in the air, and she noticed they had paused, as if waiting. "I'll be in a minute," she said. But then she forgot about going in. She forgot about the sun and how it was scorching the front of her winter-pale thighs and shins, the tops of her shoulders and her nose and the skin where her hair was parted. She stayed there all afternoon and came out again after dinner, this time in shorts and a sweatshirt to finish the book. The backyard was now in the long evening shadow of the house. As the air cooled, she drew her legs up inside the sweatshirt. After she read the last page, she looked at the picture on the cover again, then tossed the book down onto the grass. Her arms withdrew from her sleeves and joined her legs inside the warm cavern of her sweatshirt. It was a science fiction novel, about a planet in another solar system where all of the beings have lived calmly and harmoniously for thousands of their years until some people from Earth came along and screwed it all up in about 10 minutes by offering them an apple, which none of them had ever seen. The beings had been gentle and peaceful. They had lived simply but were very advanced. For example, they used mental telepathy. Their tunics, constructed somehow without any seams or fasteners, were made of a miracle fabric that kept them comfortable in any weather. The fabric was iridescent or gray, depending on whether or not you felt like telepathing. Everyone's tunic was equal but unique. You got one at birth and it grew right along with you. It had strands from your own DNA equivalent woven into it. The whole planet was nutritionally complete. You could just grab a piece of anything and eat it. The bitten thing would then regenerate. But they didn't have apples. What was it about the peaceful planet, Debbie wondered, that while it sounded beautiful and idyllic, also made her feel ornery and restless, made her want to turn up the music, eat burgers, and squirrel away mountains of material possessions while she still could. Maybe that's why the beings rode their version of pogo sticks everywhere, to bounce out the rebellious urges. She did think, though, that she would almost welcome the part about how the unseen, disembodied governing wisdom assigned everyone a mate. It happened telepathically. You just knew. Telepathy wasn't working for Debbie so far. She had felt this sudden just knowing, and had tried to casually but silently project her whole inner self or something, but the other parties, the objects of her sudden knowledge, had remained oblivious. She knew that she would have to talk. She should have been able to do it, but she developed a black hole in her brain. She could be in the middle of a normal conversation with a boy, and the instant she thought of him that way, as a boy, the black hole sucked all her words away, except for a few stupid ones. The stupid ones stayed there. She called to her dog Cupcake, who was sitting in the grass a few feet away. He trotted over, and Debbie scratched him behind the ears and talked to him. It was easy. Cupcake found everything she had to say interesting and important. He wanted to hear more. Her neck scratching transported him to a state of bliss. He offered her his throat for scratching, then his belly. If boys could be more like dogs, she thought. Or beings. End chapter 3. Chapter 4, Radio Show. Hector was late, so Phil walked across the street to see what Lenny was doing with his dad's pickup truck in the driveway. It was moving forward and back over the gravel. When Lenny saw Phil, he stopped and turned off the engine, but he left the radio on and fiddled with the dial. "What you doing?" asked Phil. "There's this weird radio show I heard last week," said Lenny. "I think it's the right time for it to come on. Go around and get in." As Phil came around the front of the pickup, he saw Debbie sitting in her backyard and waved. She was scrunched up in a lawn chair, almost completely inside of her sweatshirt. The sleeves hung empty, and all that emerged from the lumpy gray cocoon was her head on top and her pointy sneakers from the bottom. One of the sleeves came to life, and a hand popped out briefly and waved back. Seeing Phil wave, Lenny said, "Is Debbie still over there? Tell her to come listen too." Then he opened his door, hoisted up to a standing position, and told her himself, hollering over the roof of the truck. Debbie slid to the middle of the long, benchy seat. Lenny sat behind the wheel. Phil leaned against the passenger side door with his elbow hanging out of the window. It was one of the more comfy places the three of them had sat since their mothers first propped them up in neighboring corners of the sandbox, watching them from lawn chairs to make sure they didn't tip over. More often they sat on concrete stoops or on the curb, on bike seats or in the grass, sometimes kitchen chairs, but more often outside. They looked for one another when nothing else was happening, the way you pick up a magazine or look in the cupboard for a snack. Not exactly by accident, and not exactly on purpose. You could go out into the world and do new things and meet new people, and then you could come home and just sit on the stoop with someone you had never not known and watch lightning bugs blink on and off. Debbie slid down on the worn vinyl until her elbows rested on the seat cushion and put her feet up on the cracked, dusty dashboard, forming her body into the shape of the Big Dipper. It was a relief to shift her thoughts away from boys and what happened when she tried to talk to one of them. "So what's this show?" she asked Lenny. "Just listen," he said. "You'll like it." The show was called CrissCross. It started off with a lot of songs that could be considered sick, but could also be considered funny. Poisoning pigeons in the park, Don't eat the yellow snow, and Dead skunk in the middle of the road. Some were more on the sick side, some were more on the funny side, and some were just off the wall. It was the kind of radio show you would like if you liked Mad Magazine, which they all did, or had, a few years ago. There were comedy parts, too. Hector appeared at Phil's window midway through the snow and listened with them, leaning on the door. The show ended with a string of, "What do you get when you cross a something with a something else?" jokes. Then there was what must have been a clip from an old movie, a male voice saying "CrissCross," followed by what sounded like a train wreck. That was it. A commercial came on, and Lenny flipped off the radio. Debbie's feet were still propped up on the dashboard, and, in their fronts-only sunburned state, her bare legs reminded Hector of a freshly opened, unscooped box of Neapolitan ice cream, minus the chocolate stripe. "Nice tan," he observed. Then he said, "What do you get when you cross a butterfly with a dog?" "We give up," said Phil. "What?" "I don't know," said Hector. "Probably nothing." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Leg buds. Hanging out in the truck listening to the radio show got to be a regular thing. It wasn't an official plan, but almost every Saturday night through the spring, and then the summer, they all showed up and sat there in the parked truck in Lenny's driveway with the radio on. Only 3 of them could actually sit inside the truck. The other 2 had to listen through the open windows, leaning against the doors. The 5th person was Debbie's friend Patty, who came the second week, and whenever she could after that. The first time she and Debbie walked over from Debbie's backyard, Hector and Phil were already sitting inside with Lenny, but immediately they slid out and offered up their seats. This seemed unusual to Debbie. Then she realized that they were being chivalrous, like gentlemen, like men. A new part of them was emerging before her eyes, like leg buds, bumping out on tadpoles. Midway through the show, Debbie tested her theory by offering to trade places with Hector, who was leaning on the outside of the door beside her, No, he said. That's okay. I'm fine. I like standing up, leaning against a truck, for an hour. A few minutes later, he shifted his weight and said, It's fun. What is? Asked Debbie. Standing up, leaning against a truck, he said. For an hour. I don't want to be selfish, though, he said after a pause. If you wanted us some fun, too, we could trade places for a while. Debbie looked at him. He was smiling a winsome smile, a hopeful smile. Okay, she said, pulling on the handle, opening the door. She smiled, too, as she swung her legs out and hopped down off the seat. Hector helped pull the door open, and, as he stepped around it, Debbie landed with force on top of him, or at least on one of his feet, which was painful. There was a full frontal collision with a vertical slippage, as in the shifting of tectonic plates, and together they stepped one way, then the other, then back again, trying unsuccessfully to go around each other. Finally, using a move he had learned from his mother, Hector put his right hand on the small of Debbie's back, took her right hand with his left, and spun her around and away, ballroom dancing style. In his mother's lessons, his dancing partner had been Roanne, and he'd gazed into his sister's chin. Now his gaze met Debbie's eyes, inadvertently, but all the same. His mother had said this would happen. Debbie's eyes looked surprised. Then they looked away. When they looked back, they had normalized. Normal. With the curtains drawn, at least part way. Sorry, she said. Always stepping on your foot. Is it okay? It's okay, said Hector. I kind of liked it. He said it as a joke, but it wasn't entirely untrue. Then he remembered that he was supposed to be getting in the truck. So he did. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, In the Rhododendrons. Debbie and Patty stood inside a thriving mountain of rhododendrons, flowering with primeval abandon against a withered, sagging garage that was slowly subdividing into raw materials, basic elements, and individual atoms on the edge of an oily, pothole-dotted, forgotten cinder alley. The alley ran between the backsides of tall, uneven hedges that concealed parallel rows of backyards. Across the alley from the rhododendrons, the hedge was high enough that only the top bar of the swing set inside was visible. Between the rhododendrons and the old garage, a sort of room had formed, an arched private space among the branches, tall enough to stand up in. Even when it was raining, as it was now, it stayed fairly dry there. It was the perfect place to change your clothes on the way to school. You could drape the clothes you were taking off over the branches while you got the other ones on. Debbie stepped out of a pair of turquoise white and orange plaid double-knit bell-bottoms. Patty unbuttoned a flowered blouse and tossed it into a branch that already sported a brown jumper. The air was warm. They stood on top of their shoes in their underwear, the rain softly piffling on the leaves all around. 2 eaves in the Garden of Eden. If you think about it, Patty said, it shouldn't even matter what we wear. People will like us for who we are. Debbie knew this. She even believed it was true. But she also believed that certain articles of clothing could transmit almost impenetrable counter-signals, like camouflage. How will they know who I am if I'm wearing these? She asked. And Patty laughed. They're all right, she said, sort of. I mean, they're better than a jumper. I think they're equal to a jumper, said Debbie, or less than. Jumpers can be okay. The reason they were changing their clothes in a rhododendron bush was cultural evolution. Both of them who had mothers who were stranded in the backwaters of a bygone era and who were unable to grasp many current trends and ideas. You could argue and argue, but they weren't going to get it. At some point, you just had to go change your clothes in a bush. First, though, you had to acquire the clothes you wanted to change into, which were slightly faded bell-bottom jeans that almost touched the ground or did touch it, even dragging a little bit. And if you weren't yet financially independent or had spent all your money on movies and pizza, you had to get your mother to buy them for you. That could be hard. It wasn't hard for Debbie to get her mother to go shopping, but Helen Pelbury was opposed to spending money on something that was going to drag on the ground and get ruined. She could not hear the siren call of the dragging jeans. Debbie heard it. She believed that it was the only way to wear pants that made any sense, that wearing the dragging jeans did not actually guarantee that good things would happen to you, but not wearing them could almost guarantee that the good things would not. She felt sure that when she found the perfect pair, her mother would recognize their perfection and relent. But they weren't finding the perfect pair. They had been searching for hours in every store in the airy, light-filled Marionville Mall. The fountains burbled, and sunlight poured in through the skylights, encouraging the tropical trees and flowers. But Debbie and her mother had become acutely focused on the 2 inches of the earth's atmosphere just above the carpet of the dressing room floor. Though the jeans were wrong in other ways, too. It was almost dreamlike. How many ways they could be wrong in, ways that a person would not have imagined. They had wandered into quicksand, into a shopping swamp. A fog of fatigue and unreality crept up on Debbie. She could tell that her mother was getting exasperated, too. They stood close to each other in a tiny dressing room with a maximum number of items hanging from a hook on the wall. Debbie was wearing a unique pair of turquoise, white, and orange plaid bell-bottoms that hovered 3 inches from the floor. Her mother had found them. "What's wrong with these?" she asked Debbie. Her voice was careful. Her face was composed, with a trace of hopefulness. Her purse dangled from the crook of her crisscrossed arms. Debbie considered. She tried to be objective. The plaid was all right, maybe, kind of, but the pants were so short, and they had a peculiar zingy bell curve that would always be there because they were made of some miracle fiber that remembered its shape. Washing after washing. It was amazing how wrong they were, but they did have a weird perfection as objects. Not objects you would wear, just objects you would look at, like a vase. That was it, that was the shape of an upside-down plaid vase, or 2 of them, her feet blooming out on long stems. Maybe her resolve was broken by some mild, tranquilizing vapor seeping out of the ventilation vent along with the air-freshening perfume. Maybe there were subliminal messages in the upbeat, impersonal music softly emanating around the flimsy partitions. Maybe she just wanted her mother to be happy, and for them to be having a nice time together, the way they always had. Maybe it finally seemed stupid to care so much. And so Debbie heard herself saying, "These are good. I really like these." And in the instant she said it, she almost believed it. She wanted it to be true. If she could have spent her whole life in the tiny private dressing room, she might have worn those pants a lot. She said the same thing about the next pair she tried on, a pair of jeans with a machine-embroidered image at the bottom of one leg, of a bunny nibbling on a bunch of carrots. In this case, she had an ulterior motive. They were, by sheer accident or luck, the right length. "I can hem them," she said, wondering why she hadn't thought of it before. She was fibbing, but it was a noble fib, because she was really saying, "I love you, Mom. I want us to be having fun." She was also saying, "If you really love me, you won't make me hem them." But her mother only heard the words she said out loud. Her face relaxed. She looked pleased and relieved. "You sure?" she asked. "They're great," said Debbie. "I like them a lot." In the hollow of the rhododendrons, Debbie and Patty used the seam rippers they had smuggled out of their mother's sewing boxes. Debbie was carefully removing the bunny and the carrots, dropping bits of white and orange thread on the dirt. Patty was taking out the large hems she had sewed in her jeans the night before, like Penelope unraveling her weaving in the Odyssey, only backwards and for different reasons. "Maybe I can iron them out in the home ec room," she said, "so they can hang down better." "And then maybe you can smush them up so they're not all crispy," said Debbie. "I don't care so much if they're crispy," said Patty, "just so they're long enough." While they were working, a pair of playful chipmunks chased each other. through the branches, and a few fat robins, seeking refuge from the rain, now more a downpour than a drizzle, chirped. It felt very Arcadian, as if a shepherd might appear with a harp and some grapes. What appeared instead was a car blasting down the alleyway, throwing up wild sprays of puddle water as it clunked in and out of potholes. The two girls froze, only their eyes moving, and remained hidden. In the noise and commotion, neither one noticed that behind them a startled chipmunk had jumped from a narrow limb to the ground. A slender gold chain was momentarily tangled around his front paws. He dragged it for a short distance before he got free of it and scampered away. It settled down into the neatly mowed grass of someone's backyard, in the rain, getting wet. End. Chapter 6 of CrissCross by Lynn Ray Perkins.